The wheels of the plane screeched against the tarmac, jolting Macy awake from a restless sleep. Her hands clutched the arms of her wheelchair, knuckles pale against her dark skin. Around her, passengers stretched and sighed with the casual impatience of a journey's end. But for Macy, the true journey was only beginning. Outside the tiny, frosted window, the airport sprawled under a bleak grey sky. Macy adjusted the frayed strap of her backpack and glanced down at Blue, her little service puppy, curled obediently at her feet. His tail gave a nervous thump against the floor, sensing her tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Southridge Regional Airport," the intercom crackled. "Please remain seated until the aircraft comes to a full and complete stop." The seatbelt sign chimed off. Instantly, the aisle filled with people clawing at overhead bins, oblivious to the girl who would need space, who would need time. Macy lowered her eyes, used to being overlooked, used to swallowing words that nobody cared to hear. She hated airports. She hated being stared at, pitied, judged, all without anyone ever knowing her story. But today, she told herself, would be different. Today, she would meet the doctor who promised he could help her walk again. Her heart, bruised but stubborn, clung to that flicker of hope. And then she saw her, a flight attendant, tall and stern-faced, barreled down the aisle, barking orders at passengers like a warden. Her name tag gleamed, Karen B. Macy caught the flash of Karen's eyes when they landed on her, a sharp, slicing look, like Macy was something rotting in the corner. The attendant's lips curled into a thin, forced smile, one that didn't dare reach her eyes. "You'll need to wait," Karen snapped without slowing, her voice loud enough for the rows around them to hear. "We have real passengers to unload first." Heat rose to Macy's cheeks, but she said nothing. Her fingers tightened on Blue's leash. Passengers squeezed by, some glancing at her with fleeting sympathy, others pretending she wasn't there at all. The moments dragged, cold and humiliating. Karen reappeared, towering over her now. "You people always expect special treatment," she muttered under her breath, but not so low that Macy couldn't hear. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Blue whined softly. "Shut that mutt up before I throw it off the plane," Karen hissed, crouching down to Macy's level for just a moment, just long enough for Macy to see the raw contempt in her eyes. The air inside the cabin turned heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Macy realized then, no matter how many miles she traveled, no matter how hard she fought, some battles would find her wherever she went. And some monsters wore uniforms and polite smiles. Macy's hands trembled as she steadied herself in the narrow aisle, feeling the invisible weight of 100 stares, most filled with pity, a few with something colder, meaner. She lowered her head and whispered to Blue, who licked her fingers reassuringly. Karen hovered near the exit, barking false pleasantries at the passengers who passed her, smiling warmly at a blonde woman juggling shopping bags, joking with a businessman about the weather. But every time her gaze flicked back to Macy, her smile wilted into something hard and sharp. "You'll have to wait," Karen said again, this time louder, as if Macy were hard of hearing rather than simply trying to maintain dignity. "These folks paid good money for their seats. You people should know your place." Macy's stomach twisted. She tightened her grip on her wheelchair's armrests, knuckles whitening, willing herself not to cry. The floor seemed to tilt under her. She imagined herself disappearing, becoming invisible, but no such mercy came. A young mother with a toddler hesitated near Macy, giving her a look, a moment of human kindness. But Karen immediately inserted herself between them, her manicured hand on the woman's back, guiding her away. "Keep moving, ma'am. We can't have the aisle blocked." Macy's mouth went dry. She tried to swallow, tried to find her voice, but fear lodged in her throat like a stone. After what felt like a lifetime, the cabin was nearly empty. Only Macy and a few scattered passengers remained. Karen marched toward her, heels clacking against the floor with militaristic precision. She carried a paper cup in her hand, coffee, black and steaming. "You'll have to roll yourself off, sweetheart," Karen said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm not your nurse." Macy nodded, trying to maneuver her wheelchair toward the front. The uneven carpet caught her wheels again and again. Her arms ached from effort. Karen didn't move to help. She simply stood there, sipping her coffee, watching. When Macy finally managed to reach the midpoint of the aisle, her heart pounding from the struggle, Karen shifted. She took one step closer, then another. Her expression was empty. An open window to a hollow place inside her. And then, in a move so sudden Macy didn't have time to flinch, Karen accidentally stumbled forward, sloshing the entire cup of hot coffee across Macy's chest and lap. The world tilted. Burning pain bloomed across her skin. She gasped, the heat stealing the breath from her lungs. "Oh my, clumsy me!" Karen crowed, voice shrill and fake. "Maybe if you weren't blocking the whole aisle, accidents wouldn't happen." The few passengers who remained gasped. One man looked ready to speak, but Karen flashed him a warning glance, a look so fierce he seemed to shrink back into his seat. Macy sat frozen, coffee dripping from her jacket, her jeans sticking wetly to her legs. Blue barked once, sharply, sensing danger. Karen's face twisted. Without hesitation, she lashed out with her foot, catching the small dog in the ribs. Blue yelped and tumbled backward against a row of seats, whimpering. Macy's hands shot to her mouth in horror. Tears blurred her vision. "Control your beast!" Karen snarled. "If he bites someone, we'll have to put him down." Macy opened her mouth to scream, to shout, to protest, but the words collapsed inside her. Her chest ached, not just from the coffee burns, but from something deeper, something raw and endless. A uniformed man approached, a supervisor judging by his badge. For a fleeting second, Macy thought salvation had come, but Karen got to him first. "This one's causing a disturbance," she said crisply. "You know how it is." The supervisor's eyes barely skimmed over Macy before he nodded. He didn't see a scared girl in a wheelchair. He didn't see the soaked clothes or the trembling dog. He only saw the version of the story that made his job easier. "Come on, miss," he said gruffly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Macy stared at him, disbelieving. A sick, helpless anger bloomed inside her chest. No one helped. No one spoke up. Around her, silence closed in like a noose. Blue crawled shakily into her lap, nuzzling her arm. Macy lowered her head. She let them lead her away like a criminal, not because she was guilty, but because she was alone. Because in this place, in this sky, some lives were still considered less than others, and those who wore uniforms were often the ones who taught you exactly how little you mattered. The hallway outside the plane was cold, sterile, and somehow even less welcoming than the cabin had been. Macy rolled her wheelchair slowly, the wet fabric of her jeans clinging uncomfortably to her legs, coffee dripping with each push of her wheels. Blue trotted beside her, keeping close, casting anxious glances upward. Ahead, 2 security guards stood waiting. Their arms were crossed, their faces unreadable, but Macy felt the judgment radiating from them like heat from a flame. One of them tapped a thick finger against his radio as she approached, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her. "Passenger 14C?" he asked curtly. Macy nodded. Her voice had abandoned her, shriveled somewhere deep inside. "Come with us," he ordered. No explanation, no kindness. Blue whimpered, pressing his small body tighter against her footrests. They led her through a maze of back corridors, away from the warmth and bustle of the arriving passengers, away from the smiles and reunions. The walls seemed to lean inward, squeezing her, the fluorescent lights above buzzing like angry insects. Nobody said what she had done wrong. Nobody offered her water to rinse the coffee from her burns. They only marched her forward, like she was carrying something contagious, something dangerous. Finally, they stopped at a small, windowless room. The door slammed behind them with a heavy thud that made Blue flinch. "Bag on the table," one guard said. Macy fumbled to lift her backpack, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear. She placed it on the metal table. The second guard unzipped it roughly, pouring through her few possessions, a change of clothes, a dog toy, a book about physical therapy. He pulled each item out with a sneer, as if expecting to find weapons hidden among the stuffed animals and crumpled receipts. "Anything you want to tell us before we find it ourselves?" the first guard said, folding his arms across his chest. Macy stared at him, confusion battling the icy spike of fear in her stomach. She shook her head silently. He chuckled. A low, ugly sound. Of course not. You people never do. The way he said it, like she was less than human, like she belonged to some inferior species, made Macy's skin crawl. She opened her mouth to object, but no sound came out. Just a dry rasp of breath. Behind her, Blue barked once, a small, desperate noise. "Get that mutt out of here," the second guard snapped. He shoved Macy's wheelchair roughly to the side. She grabbed the arms to steady herself, heart hammering against her ribs. One of the guards produced a leash, a thin nylon rope, and looped it around Blue's neck. Macy's hands shot out instinctively. "Please," she croaked. "He's my service dog." The guard didn't even look at her. He tugged the rope sharply, dragging Blue a few feet away before tying him to a heavy table leg. Blue whined, straining against the leash, his paws scrabbling helplessly on the linoleum. Macy's body shook with a combination of rage and helplessness. They were treating him like a stray, like garbage. "Sit down," the first guard barked. Macy stayed frozen for a second too long. A mistake. The guard stepped forward, grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, and yanked her roughly toward the center of the room. Her body jolted from the force, her coffee-soaked clothes clinging coldly to her skin. She looked up at him, blinking back tears. His face was blank. No hatred, no anger, just the impersonal cruelty of someone who had long since stopped seeing people as people. "What are you even doing here?" he muttered under his breath. "Leeching off real citizens. Traveling around with your little sob story. Bet you thought you could get something for free, huh?" Each word hit Macy like a slap. She wanted to scream that she was here for medical treatment, that she wasn't some charity case, that she deserved to be treated like a human being. But deep down, she knew it didn't matter. To them, her truth was invisible. They weren't interested in who she was, only in who they had already decided she must be. The second guard finished rifling through her belongings and tossed them carelessly into a pile. Her clean clothes hit the dirty floor, her therapy book landing with a heavy slap. "Nothing suspicious," he said with a smirk. "Unless reading is a crime now." The first guard snorted. "Depends on who's doing the reading." They left her there, under buzzing lights, cold coffee drying sticky against her skin, her dog tied up like a common animal, her dignity crushed piece by piece. Somewhere, beyond the thick metal walls, families laughed and embraced. Suitcases rattled across clean tiles. Sunlight streamed through vast glass windows. But for Macy, the world had shrunk to this single, windowless room, and outside it, justice was just another thing she could never reach. Let's take a short pause. If you're listening to this story, share in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever faced something similar, your experience matters. Make sure to subscribe so you stay with us until the very end. We continue. The minutes dragged into hours. No one came to check on Macy. No one offered her a blanket, or a word, or even a glance. The guards outside the door talked and laughed among themselves, their voices a dull, distant buzz. Macy sat stiffly in her chair, her clothes stiff with dried coffee, her body aching from the cold. Blue whimpered from where he was tied. Macy whispered to him, her voice cracking. She hated feeling so powerless. She hated that she could do nothing but sit there, invisible, dismissed. Finally, the door creaked open. Macy straightened, her heart leaping, hope flickering to life for just a second. But it wasn't help. Karen stood in the doorway. She leaned casually against the frame, arms crossed, a smirk playing across her lips. No uniform now, just plain clothes, but her presence was even more menacing, stripped of professional pretense. "Well, well," Karen drawled, letting her gaze rake over Macy. "Still here. Guess they didn't decide to deport you after all." Macy blinked, too stunned to speak. Karen stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She crouched down to Macy's eye level, her perfume sharp and cloying. "You think people like you deserve everything for free," Karen whispered. "You think if you look sad enough, weak enough, someone will always swoop in and save you." Macy clenched her fists in her lap. Blue growled low in his throat. Karen's smile twisted. "Let me give you some advice, sweetheart. No one's coming. No one cares. She reached out and, with a casual flick of her fingers, tipped Macy's therapy book off the table onto the floor. The sound of it hitting echoed around the small room like a gunshot. Macy's breath caught in her throat. Karen stood, brushed imaginary dust off her jeans, and looked down at her one last time. "You people always think you're victims," she said. "Maybe it's time you learned you're just forgotten." And then she turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind her with a hollow finality. Macy stared at the closed door, feeling something deep inside her crack. A quiet, clean break. The world she had believed in, a world where hard work, kindness, and hope meant something, was shrinking into something colder, something meaner. Blue whined, trying to crawl closer despite the short leash. Macy wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not for them. Somewhere beyond these walls, the sky stretched wide and open. Somewhere, there were people who still believed in second chances, in fairness, in right and wrong. But here, in this room, Macy realized that survival meant accepting a hard truth. Kindness could be a weapon. Hope could be a trap. And sometimes the only way to survive was to grow colder than the world that wanted to crush you. The world outside that room felt so far away, like a dream Macy could no longer touch. Hours passed. Maybe days. She didn't know. The cold light in the room didn't change, and the faint sound of muffled footsteps in the hallway outside was the only sound that kept her tethered to reality. Blue had fallen asleep at her feet, his little body curled into a tight ball. His soft breathing was the only comfort she had left. It reminded her of the world before all this, before the airport, before the flight. Back when life had seemed like a series of ordinary events, not this endless cycle of pain and indignity, her stomach growled, the ache reminding her of the hours she had spent without food, without a moment of kindness or care. She reached for her bag, fumbling with the zipper, but before she could pull out anything, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Karen who stood in the doorway. It was the supervisor, the one who had stood idly by when Karen had poured coffee on her and kicked Blue, the one who had watched her like she was nothing. His face was cold, devoid of emotion. He didn't offer any apologies, didn't make any gestures of kindness. Instead, he simply stepped into the room and motioned for Macy to follow him. Macy hesitated. She didn't know where they were taking her, what new humiliation awaited her, but something in her stirred. She couldn't stay here, not like this. She couldn't let this be the end of her story. She grabbed Blue's leash and gave him a gentle tug. "Come on, boy," she whispered, her voice cracked from days of silence. "Let's go." The supervisor's eyes flicked down at Blue as he barked once, a high-pitched yelp that echoed off the walls. But the man said nothing. He simply turned on his heel and began walking. Macy followed, dragging herself slowly, trying to ignore the pain in her legs that had begun to settle deep into her muscles. She had been sitting for too long. She was stiff, exhausted, and afraid. They walked through the hallway, down the same sterile corridors that felt like a maze to Macy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the walls all white and impersonal. Everything in this place seemed to be designed to make people feel small, invisible. They reached a small office near the end of the hallway. The supervisor opened the door and waved for Macy to enter. The room was cramped and smelled faintly of stale coffee. A desk sat at the far end, cluttered with papers and a few empty coffee cups. There was a chair on the opposite side of the desk, a chair that Macy assumed she was supposed to sit in. She rolled her wheelchair forward, Blue padding softly behind her. The supervisor didn't sit. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. "Sit down," he said flatly. Macy did as she was told, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat, as if the air in this place was thick with something far heavier than just fear. "You've caused a lot of trouble," the supervisor began, his voice calm but cutting, like he was already tired of this entire situation. "You're lucky you're even still here." Macy blinked, stunned. "What do you mean?" He scoffed, taking a step closer to her. Don't play innocent. We all saw what happened. You made a scene on that plane, and you got the attention of everyone here. The staff had to step in. You're lucky we haven't made a bigger deal out of it. Macy's chest tightened. She didn't understand. She hadn't done anything. Karen had humiliated her, not the other way around. I didn't do anything, she whispered, the words barely audible. The supervisor's lips curled into a slight sneer. Really? So you didn't deliberately cause a disruption on that plane? You didn't make everyone uncomfortable with your presence? The word presence hung in the air, heavy with a meaning Macy didn't want to confront. She felt the sting of it. She knew exactly what he was implying. She was black. She was disabled. And to people like him, that was already enough to make her a problem. You don't belong here, he said, his voice low and harsh. You should have stayed where you came from. People like you don't need to travel around with the rest of us. Macy's heart pounded in her chest. His words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. She had heard racism before, had felt the sting of it her entire life. But here, in this moment, it was different. It was personal. It was her. Please, she said, voice shaking. I'm just trying to get help. I'm just trying to get better. The supervisor didn't respond. Instead, he motioned toward the door. You're not getting anything, and you never will. Before Macy could speak again, the door opened, and Karen stepped inside, wearing her smug smile like a mask. She closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. Macy's heart skipped. She knew what was coming. It was clear now that Karen had been the one pulling the strings all along, orchestrating everything. The coffee, the humiliation, the isolation. You've been nothing but a problem, Karen said coldly, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at Macy. And now we have to take care of it. Macy's stomach churned. Take care of what? What have I done wrong? Karen laughed, the sound chilling. You think you're a victim, don't you? You think you're special just because you're you. The words hit Macy like a slap. She had been called so many things in her life, but nothing quite like this. You're nothing, Karen continued. Just another person who thinks the world owes them something. The supervisor stepped forward. We've given you enough chances. Now you'll pay for causing all this trouble. Please, Macy said again, her voice barely a whisper. Please, I just need to get to my appointment. I'm not causing trouble. I'm just trying to get better. Karen's eyes flashed with something dark, something ugly. She stepped forward and grabbed the leash from Macy's hands, yanking it hard. You think you're so special, huh? Think you deserve any help? You deserve nothing. Macy felt her heart race. She could see where this was going, and she couldn't stop it. She couldn't stop them. Blue whimpered again, tugging against the leash, but Karen held it tight, her fingers tightening around the thin rope. The supervisor watched impassively. There was no compassion in his eyes, no remorse for the cruelty he was enabling. He just stood there, silent, like he didn't care about any of this, like Macy's pain meant nothing. Take her to the back room, Karen said, her voice laced with satisfaction. We'll show her what happens when people think they can do whatever they want. Macy didn't fight it. She couldn't. She had already fought so much, and every fight had only brought more pain. She was exhausted. She was broken. But she still had Blue. She still had something to hold on to, even as the world around her crumbled into nothing. The supervisor gestured to the door, and the two of them began to move toward it. Macy's heart sank. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew it wouldn't be good. The fluorescent lights above hummed, casting a sterile, sickly glow across the small room. It was colder here, much colder than it had been in the small office. The walls seemed to close in, reflecting the tightness in Macy's chest, the suffocating weight of what was happening. She could feel the pulse in her temples, throbbing in time with her heartbeat. She had been dragged through this place, this nightmare, for so long that it felt like she would never escape it. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through her bones. She could hear the soft sound of keys clicking in the lock, followed by the faintest murmur of voices beyond the thick, heavy door. For a brief moment, she almost thought that she was alone, that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment they had abandoned her. But that thought was fleeting, swallowed up by the harshness of the reality she was in. "Sit down," Karen's voice rang out, as cold and hard as the metal chair that stood at the center of the room. She was standing by the door, leaning casually against the frame, her arms crossed, her eyes watching Macy with a cold, disdainful amusement. It was the same look she had worn from the moment they met, the same look that seemed to say, "You don't belong here. You never did." Macy didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking too violently to even reach for the armrests of her wheelchair. The weight of everything, all the pain, the humiliation, the racism, it was too much. She wanted to shout, to scream, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just stared at the floor, her gaze fixed on the scuffed tiles beneath her. Karen's laugh echoed through the room, sharp and biting. "You think you can just sit there, all high and mighty, like you're some kind of victim. You're nothing." Macy's chest tightened. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't let them see how broken she was. She couldn't. Not for them. Not for anyone. "Get up," Karen ordered, stepping forward with deliberate slowness. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor with every step, each one louder than the last. "I told you to sit down, but now you're not moving fast enough. You're just wasting everyone's time." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Macy could feel her stomach churn, her hands gripping the arms of her chair until her knuckles were white. The pressure in her chest mounted, threatening to explode. She wanted to fight back, to tell Karen everything she was feeling, to scream at her for the cruelty she was inflicting. But the words stayed trapped inside her. She couldn't get them out. "You really think you're something special, don't you?" Karen continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look at you, sitting there, expecting us to treat you like a person, like you matter. You're nothing but a charity case that doesn't even know its place." The venom in Karen's words hit Macy like a punch to the gut. She had always known that people saw her differently. She had always known that people looked at her, looked at the color of her skin, the wheelchair, and saw something less than human. But hearing it said out loud, so casually, so coldly, made her feel like she was drowning, like she was suffocating on the weight of all their hatred and disdain. Macy took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't going to let Karen win. She wasn't going to let her break her. But Karen wasn't done. She moved closer, standing over Macy like a predator sizing up its prey. "You think this is bad? You haven't seen anything yet." The words sent a chill through Macy's body. She wanted to turn away, to look anywhere but at Karen, but her gaze was fixed. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the reality of what was happening. Karen grabbed the back of Macy's wheelchair roughly, jerking it forward. The wheels screeched across the floor, sending a jolt of pain through Macy's arms. The sudden movement made her heart race. Her breathing quickened as she struggled to maintain control, her body tense, every muscle screaming in protest. "You're going to stand up, whether you like it or not," Karen said, her tone colder than ice. "You're going to prove that you can do it, that you can be useful, because right now you're just a burden." Macy's head spun. She could feel the dizziness creeping in, the lightheadedness from days of stress, pain, and fear. She clenched her teeth, fighting the overwhelming urge to collapse, to give in to the despair that threatened to consume her. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Karen stepped back and folded her arms, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Well, go on then. Stand up. Show me how capable you are. Show me that you're not just a pathetic little charity case." Macy closed her eyes, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. She couldn't do it. Not with the pain in her legs. Not after everything she had been through. But the pressure, the force of Karen's words, was too much. She knew that if she didn't do something, if she didn't try, the humiliation would be worse than anything she had endured so far. With trembling hands, She pushed herself up from the chair, her arms shaking from the effort. Her legs felt like rubber, unsteady and weak beneath her. She took a few unsteady steps, each one a battle, each one a slow, painful movement forward. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in, but she kept going. She couldn't stop. Not now. Karen watched her, her expression unreadable, but Macy could feel the eyes of judgment on her. Every step felt like 100 eyes were watching her, waiting for her to fall, waiting for her to fail. "Look at you," Karen sneered. "You're pathetic. You think anyone cares that you can stand for a second? You're just proving my point. You're nothing." Macy's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to the floor with a sharp gasp, the impact sending a jolt of pain through her entire body. She winced, her face flushed with shame, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Karen stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound like the ticking of a clock counting down to her final moment of humiliation. "Pathetic," Karen spat. "I knew you couldn't do it. You should have known better. People like you don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere." Macy could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. She blinked, trying to push them back, but they came anyway. They streamed down her face, mingling with the dirt and sweat that had accumulated during her ordeal. Karen bent down, her face close to Macy's. "Cry all you want. It won't make a difference. You'll always be nothing. Just another problem to be ignored, another burden. And nobody will care." The words stung more than the pain in her legs. They crushed her spirit, squeezed her chest until she thought she might break in two. But deep down, a small part of her, a stubborn part that had refused to die, clung to the belief that this wasn't the end. Not yet. But at this moment, in the crushing silence that followed Karen's cruel words, Macy couldn't help but feel like she was disappearing. Like the world was erasing her, one humiliation at a time. The air felt thick. Each breath Macy took seemed to become harder, each one more desperate than the last. She had tried to stand, had tried to show them she could be more than what they saw, more than the burden they had decided she was. And yet here she was, sprawled on the cold floor, her legs useless beneath her, her face flushed with embarrassment and pain. The sound of her breath was the only thing she could hear. The room was unnervingly silent, except for the soft shuffle of Karen's shoes on the floor, approaching slowly, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Pathetic," Karen's voice echoed in the stillness. "You thought you could prove something? You thought you could stand up to me?" Macy's chest heaved as she fought to catch her breath, her eyes locked on the floor. She couldn't look at Karen anymore, couldn't face the cold, hateful eyes that had torn her down again and again. She wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, but the raw powerlessness in her soul kept her still, rooted to the floor by the gravity of her own shame. "Get up," Karen demanded, her voice an icy command. Macy wanted to protest. She wanted to shout that she couldn't, that her legs were too weak, her body too exhausted from everything that had happened. But instead, she just stared at the floor, her hands clenched into fists. The humiliation of failing again was suffocating. She could feel it creeping under her skin, a gnawing feeling that made her want to shrink into nothingness. "You really are useless," Karen said, her words dripping with scorn. "You think anyone here cares about your so-called struggle? They don't. You're nothing but an inconvenience." Macy's eyes stung as she blinked back tears, but they wouldn't stop. Her throat constricted, her body trembling with the effort to stay composed. She wanted to shout at Karen, to tell her she was wrong, that she wasn't nothing. But the words didn't come. The pain in her chest, not just physical but emotional, had rendered her silent. Karen stepped forward, her voice growing colder. "You think you can just stumble through life, expecting sympathy? You think because you have a disability and because of the color of your skin, people are supposed to care? Well, you're wrong. You're nothing more than a reminder that not everyone deserves to be helped." Every word hit like a hammer. Macy felt the weight of the cruel words crushing her spirit, leaving her breathless. She wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, but she couldn't. She couldn't fight this battle, not here, not now. She had no power, no strength left. Karen leaned down, crouching next to Macy, her eyes glinting with something dark and cruel. "This is who you are, Macy. You're a burden. You'll always be a burden. You'll never matter." Macy's heart raced, the tears threatening to spill over once again. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing the world away, wishing this nightmare would end. But when she opened them, Karen was still there, towering over her like a shadow, smirking at her misery. "Look at you," Karen hissed. "You're nothing but a charity case, a pity project. Everyone around you is just pretending to care because they feel sorry for you, but they don't really care. They just want to feel good about themselves. They don't want to look at the truth. You'll never be anything more than a broken, useless thing." Macy shook her head, the words cutting through her like blades. She knew she wasn't broken. She wasn't useless, but Karen's venomous accusations made her feel like she was. The weight of everything, the isolation, the judgment, the cruelty, was unbearable. She wanted to stand up, to scream at Karen and tell her that she mattered, that she was worthy of respect. But the fight was draining out of her. How could she fight this when the entire system, this place, this world, was against her? "Get up!" Karen shouted, pulling Macy by the shoulder roughly. "Prove to me that you're not useless." Macy gasped as the force of Karen's grip made her stumble. She couldn't hold herself up. Her legs wobbled beneath her, uncooperative, weak from everything that had happened. "No," Macy whispered, her voice hoarse, cracked with emotion. "I can't." "Oh, so now you're giving up?" Karen laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You're pathetic. You're nothing. You're just one more person who thinks the world owes them something, and when it doesn't, you break, you fall apart, just like I knew you would." Macy wanted to scream, to let the frustration, the anger, the helplessness spill out of her, but all that came out was a soft sob. She couldn't even fight the tears anymore. She couldn't fight the way Karen's words were tearing through her like a storm. But then, from somewhere deep inside, a flicker of resistance sparked, small, faint, but it was there. It was the part of her that refused to be fully crushed. It was the part of her that had kept going, that had kept fighting, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. Karen's laugh faded into silence as she took a step back, watching Macy with an almost bored expression. "Cry all you want, it won't change anything. You'll always be the same, a broken, useless thing." The words felt like poison seeping into Macy's soul, but for the first time in days, Macy didn't let them crush her completely. For the first time, she forced herself to meet Karen's gaze, her eyes burning with something stronger than despair, something that felt like a silent promise, a promise that this wasn't the end. "I may be broken," Macy said, her voice quiet but steady, "but I am not useless. I will fight, and you won't break me." Karen's face flickered with surprise for a moment, as if she hadn't expected Macy to respond like this. But it didn't last. She smirked again, the malice in her eyes returning. "Fight all you want. It won't change the truth. You'll always be what you are." Macy stayed silent. She didn't need to say anything more. She had spoken the truth. The truth was something Karen couldn't take away. It was something that even in the midst of all this hatred, all this cruelty, Macy still held on to. As the door to the room opened again, the supervisor stepped in, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Macy, then at Karen, and then turned his attention back to her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Without a word, he moved forward and helped Macy into her wheelchair, though his touch was stiff, impersonal. There was no apology, no kindness, just the coldness of someone who had long since given up on caring. "We're done here," he said, his voice flat. "You're going back to your room." Macy didn't say anything as he wheeled her out of the room, past Karen, who stood silently by the door. She didn't have the energy to fight anymore, not right now. But as they moved through the hallways, her heart still beat with something she hadn't felt in days. Something like resolve. This wasn't over. Not yet. The cold, sterile walls of the small holding room felt suffocating. Macy sat alone, her hands clutching the arms of her wheelchair, her fingers raw from the strain. Her legs were still weak from the attempt to stand, the pain lingering in her muscles, a constant reminder of how little control she had left over her own body. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, but even that felt difficult. She had been in this room for what felt like hours, maybe even longer. Time was slipping away, each minute blending into the next, until they all felt the same. There was no clock, no window to the outside world, just the dim overhead light buzzing softly, making her feel like she was trapped in a place that wasn't meant for her. It was as if the walls were closing in, the silence suffocating her. Blue, her small dog, lay curled up on the floor beside her, his tail occasionally thumping the ground as he slept, unaware of the cruelty unfolding around them. Macy reached down and gently stroked his fur, trying to soothe herself. His presence was the only thing that kept her tethered to any semblance of normalcy. But even that comfort felt fleeting, like everything in her life was slipping further out of reach. The door creaked open suddenly, and Macy's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who it was this time, but she could feel the weight of their gaze before they even entered. The familiar, condescending footsteps echoed down the hallway before the door opened fully, and there stood the supervisor, his face as cold as ever, his eyes scanning her like a piece of furniture. "Up!" he ordered, his tone harsh. Macy didn't move at first. She didn't want to. She had no energy left. Every inch of her body was screaming for rest, for peace, for a break from the relentless humiliation. But the supervisor wasn't giving her that choice. "I said up," he repeated, his voice harder this time, a subtle threat hanging in the air. Slowly, Macy began to push herself up from the chair. Her arms trembled as she forced herself into a sitting position, then carefully maneuvered her legs to the floor, wincing as the movement triggered a sharp pain in her joints. She hated this, hated how fragile and weak she felt. But what choice did she have? She had no voice, no power. Just the expectation that she would continue to endure. "Move!" the supervisor barked. She tried to roll her chair forward, but it was like her body was betraying her. Her legs weren't cooperating. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and it only made her movements slower, more clumsy. She hated feeling like this, like a burden, like she was only there to be used, to be watched, to be belittled. "You can't even move on your own." The supervisor's voice dripped with mockery. "Pathetic." Macy clenched her jaw, her hands shaking as she tried to move again. It was like every ounce of strength she had left was being drained away. Every step felt like she was sinking deeper into quicksand, and with each passing second, it was harder to find the energy to fight. "Come on," the supervisor goaded, taking a step forward and grabbing the back of her wheelchair. "Let's get this over with." He wheeled her down the narrow hallway, the harsh clicking of his boots on the floor ringing in her ears. The sterile, lifeless walls seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, and Macy couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led deeper into some dark abyss, where she was just another number, just another person to be ignored and discarded. They reached another room, a larger one this time. There were several other people standing around, their faces mostly turned away, as if they were avoiding eye contact with her. But Macy knew they weren't avoiding her because they didn't see her. They avoided her because they didn't want to acknowledge the truth of what was happening. The supervisor parked her in front of a small table, and Macy felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She didn't know what was happening, what was coming next, but she could feel it in her gut. She could feel the tension in the air, the subtle menace that hung over everything. Karen appeared next, stepping into the room with that same smug smile on her face, the one that had haunted Macy since the moment they met. It was the smile of someone who believed they had already won, someone who thought they had the power to crush you without consequence. "Well, well," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension as she looked down at Macy. "You're still here, I see. I thought you might have learned your lesson by now." Macy didn't respond. She couldn't. She was too tired, too defeated. "I see you've been struggling," Karen continued, her eyes narrowing. "But that's to be expected. After all, you don't really belong here, do you? You never did." The words hit her like a physical blow. Macy could feel the anger bubbling up in her chest, but she forced it down. She had no energy left for a fight. She had no fight left. "Get up!" Karen demanded, her voice sharp and imperious. "You can't just sit there like that. You're not worthy of sitting." Macy's hands shook as she gripped the armrest of her chair. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell Karen that she wasn't worthless, that she wasn't a burden. But the words got caught in her throat. She couldn't say anything. It felt like the weight of everything. The humiliation, the racism, the years of being told she didn't matter, was crushing her from the inside out. Karen stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something cruel. "You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you? You think you deserve to be treated like anyone else, like you're just as good as us. But you're not. You're nothing." Macy didn't know how much longer she could take this. Her vision blurred as her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to shout, to scream at Karen that she was wrong, that she was more than this. But every time she tried to find her voice, the words got stuck. "Stand up," Karen repeated, her voice low and threatening. "Prove to me you're not worthless." The pressure was suffocating. Macy tried to push herself up again, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her body was betraying her, refusing to do what she needed it to. Her arms trembled with the effort, but every attempt to stand was met with failure. Karen's laugh was cruel and mocking. "Pathetic," she sneered. "You can't even stand. You can't even prove that you're worth anything." The words stung, but Macy didn't respond. She couldn't. She had no fight left in her. She felt like she was disappearing, like she was being erased, like she was becoming a shadow of the person she used to be. The supervisor stepped forward then, his hand on the back of her wheelchair, pushing it forward with a jerk. "Enough. Let's get her back where she belongs." But Karen wasn't finished. She stepped forward, blocking the way. "You think this is over?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just leave here and pretend none of this happened?" Macy didn't respond. She couldn't. She had no more strength to give, no more words to speak. She was empty, hollow. Karen stood there for a moment, watching Macy like a predator watching its prey. Then, with a final glance, she turned and walked away. The supervisor didn't say a word as he wheeled Macy back to the small room she had been kept in for what felt like an eternity. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was alone again. Alone with the weight of everything that had happened. Alone with the knowledge that, in their eyes, she would never be anything more than a burden. But deep inside her, something still lingered, a flicker of something she couldn't name. It was small, it was weak, but it was there. And as long as it was there, Macy knew she wasn't finished yet. The air in the small room felt colder now. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a faint hum that only seemed to add to the weight pressing down on Macy. Her body felt like it was made of stone, every movement a struggle, her muscles stiff and aching from the constant tension. The silence was almost deafening. No one came. No one asked how she was doing. No one even glanced in her direction. Her mind was clouded, the thoughts swirling like a storm, but nothing coherent ever formed. Everything was fragmented. The constant humiliation, the racial slurs, the stares. It was all too much to process. She was trapped in a system that had never wanted her here in the first place. The people around her treated her like she was nothing. Less than nothing. But there was something inside her that refused to die. Something deep, hidden beneath the pain, that still had the strength to fight. Even now, with everything working against her, Macy refused to completely surrender. She had been through too much already to give up so easily. The door opened with a soft squeal, and Macy's heart skipped in her chest. She knew who it was before they even entered. The supervisor stood in the doorway, his face as cold and indifferent as ever, as if he had no regard for the human being sitting in front of him. "Up," he commanded, his tone flat. Macy didn't even look up at him. She wasn't sure if she could bring herself to move again. The idea of standing, of facing more ridicule, was overwhelming. Her body trembled from exhaustion, from the strain of everything she had already endured. But the pressure was too much. She pushed herself up, though her legs felt like dead weight beneath her. Every muscle in her body protested, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The supervisor didn't wait for her to fully stabilize before he grabbed the back of her wheelchair roughly and yanked it forward. pushing her down the hall with no regard for her comfort or the pain she was in. Macy's breath quickened, her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She could feel the stares of the others in the hall, their eyes darting quickly away as she passed, too afraid to make eye contact, too ashamed to do anything but watch her like she was a sideshow. She knew what they saw, a broken, weak, black girl in a wheelchair, and that alone was enough for them to write her off. That was all they needed to know. That was all they cared about. She passed them in silence, the sound of her wheelchair's wheels scraping against the floor almost deafening in the quiet hallway. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them what she was really capable of, but she had long stopped expecting that kind of understanding. Nobody ever saw her. Not really. They reached a larger room, one Macy had never been in before. The walls were bare, and the harsh overhead lights flickered like they were about to go out. The supervisor stopped just inside the doorway, and for a moment, it seemed like he might actually say something, but he didn't. Instead, he motioned for her to move into the center of the room, where a few figures stood, watching her silently. Macy felt the pit of her stomach drop. She didn't know who they were. More employees, officials, she had no idea. But whatever it was, she could feel that they were waiting for something, waiting for her to do something. Her heart raced, and she could hear the blood pounding in her ears. One of the figures stepped forward, a man with cold, calculating eyes. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about him that made Macy uneasy. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Macy didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. She didn't know how to respond to that question. She had asked herself the same thing over and over again in the past few days. Who was she really in this place? What was left of her after everything that had happened? But she couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not now. "I'm not here to make you feel comfortable," the man continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're here because we need to see if you're really worth anything, if you have any use in this system, if you're capable of being anything other than a burden." Macy felt something in her snap. That's what it always came down to. That's what they thought of her. She wasn't a person to them. She was a project, a problem to be solved, a burden to be discarded, and no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she tried to hold on to the scraps of dignity she had left, they would never see her for who she truly was. "Is that it?" Macy asked, her voice rough but steady. "Is that all you see me as? A burden?" The man's lip curled in a slight smile. "You think you have a right to more. You think you have a right to dignity. You have no place here. You were never meant to be part of this world. You're just here because we have to give you something, a few crumbs of charity, and then you can go back to being nothing." Macy's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to fight, to stand tall, to tell them they were wrong, that she wasn't some charity case, some piece of trash they could dispose of. But the words didn't come. What could she say to people who had already decided her worth? What could she say to people who looked at her and saw only what was on the surface? Who saw the wheelchair, the color of her skin, and assumed they knew everything about her? The supervisor stepped forward, his cold eyes locking on hers. "You don't belong here," he repeated. "You never did. You don't have the right to be in this space. You don't have the right to ask for respect. You don't have the right to anything." And with those words, the world around her seemed to collapse in on itself. She could feel the walls closing in. She could feel the tears rising in her eyes, threatening to spill over. But she fought them back. She couldn't cry in front of them. She wouldn't let them see her break. The man with cold eyes stepped closer, his hand resting on the table in front of him. "You're lucky we're giving you this chance. Lucky that we haven't just thrown you away. But you're going to have to prove yourself. Show us that you can be useful. Show us that you have value. Otherwise, you're done." Macy swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to shout at them, to tell them that she was more than they could ever imagine. But the words stayed trapped in her chest. Her hands shook as she reached for the arms of her wheelchair, pushing herself back into it with all the strength she could muster. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up the fight, but in the pit of her stomach, there was a flicker, small and weak, but still there. A whisper in the back of her mind telling her to keep going, no matter what. No matter what they said. No matter what they did. She wasn't done yet. The silence in the room was suffocating. The coldness of the walls felt like they were pressing in, narrowing the space, making it impossible for Macy to breathe. But somehow, she managed to steady her breath, slow it down, focusing on the only thing she had left, her will to survive. The man with the cold eyes, the one who had been tormenting her since the beginning, stood in front of her, watching her like a specimen under a microscope. His face was impassive, almost mechanical, like he wasn't even seeing her. He was seeing the idea of her, the stereotype, the problem that needed to be dealt with. "You still think you're better than this," he said, his words slow, deliberate, and dripping with disdain. "You still think you're entitled to respect, to dignity. But you're not. You'll never be." Macy felt the anger rise inside her again. She had been hearing this same narrative for so long, that she wasn't worth anything, that she would never amount to anything, and every time they told her that, every time they looked at her like she was less than human, it only pushed her to dig deeper, to fight harder. She had learned early on that they didn't care about her. She wasn't a person to them. She was just an object of pity, of judgment, something they could throw away once they were done with her. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. Her hands tightened around the wheelchair's armrests, her fingers digging into the cold metal. The weight of the pain in her body, the bruises, the burns, the exhaustion, it was all still there. But now it felt different. Now it felt like something had shifted, like she had found some deep, hidden strength. "You don't have to speak," the man continued, his voice filled with mockery. "We all know what you're thinking, that you deserve more, that you should be treated like everyone else. But that's not going to happen. Not here. Not now." Macy didn't flinch. She didn't say a word. She just stared at him, her gaze unwavering, despite the flood of emotions crashing inside her. She could feel the tears stinging her eyes, but she wasn't going to let them fall. Not now. Not for them. "You're a mistake," he said, the finality in his tone like the closing of a door. "And mistakes get erased." Macy's breath caught. Every word was like a stab to her heart, a confirmation of everything they had tried to make her believe. That she didn't matter, that she was nothing. But for the first time, instead of feeling crushed under the weight of those words, she felt something else. Something like clarity. She had been taught her whole life to keep her head down, to take what was given, to accept her place. But she had learned something different through all the pain. She had learned that the world would always try to keep her small, to keep her quiet, to keep her invisible. But she was not small. She was not invisible. She was here, and she was not giving up. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady, each word a statement of defiance. "I am not a mistake. I am not what you think I am. I am more than your judgment, more than the box you've tried to put me in. You can't erase me. You can't erase the truth." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Macy thought he might lash out. But instead, he simply turned and walked away, as if he didn't even have the energy to argue with her anymore, as if she had become insignificant to him. But Macy knew the truth. She knew that she had hit a nerve. "You think you've won," Macy called after him, her voice rising now, filled with emotion. "But you haven't. You haven't broken me, and you won't." There was a long silence. She didn't know what he was thinking, what was going through his mind. But she didn't care anymore. All she cared about was that she had said the words, that she had found her voice, despite everything they had done to try and silence it. The door opened, and Karen stepped inside. She had the same smug expression, the one that had never once faltered. But now, Macy wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of her or anyone else in this place. "Still here?" Karen sneered. "I guess I should have expected that. You really are stubborn, aren't you?" Macy didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she met Karen's gaze, and for the first time, There was no fear there, no shame, just the steady resolve of someone who had fought and survived. You think this is a victory? Karen continued, stepping closer. You think you've won? Look at you. Look at your life. You're nothing. Macy took a deep breath, her chest rising with the intake of air. She had heard this before. She had heard it from every corner of her life, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was done with their lies, done with their cruelty. Maybe you think I'm nothing, Macy said softly, but I know who I am, and I know what I'm worth. No one else can take that from me. Karen paused, as if the words had stopped her in her tracks. Macy could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the brief hesitation as she tried to figure out what to do next. But Macy wasn't going to give her that power. She wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. Karen stepped back, her face twisting with frustration. But Macy just sat there, looking at her with quiet defiance, a calm strength radiating from her. You may have the power here, Macy said, her voice low but unwavering, but you will never have the power to control me. Not anymore. And with that, the room fell silent. No more mocking words, no more insults. The power had shifted, and Macy knew it. She had nothing left to prove to anyone. The battle had been long, it had been painful, but she had won. She wasn't the woman they wanted her to be. She wasn't their idea of weakness. She wasn't broken. She was still here. And that was enough. The door opened again, and the supervisor reappeared. He didn't say anything this time. He didn't need to. He just motioned for her to follow, but Macy remained still. She wasn't going anywhere until she was ready. She looked out the small window in the corner of the room, the sunlight streaming in, the world beyond still waiting, and she knew, as she looked out into the world she had yet to conquer, that she was more than capable of surviving it. She had always been more than they could see. As we reach the end of this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did this story resonate with you? Have you ever experienced something like racism or prejudice in your own life? Your experiences and perspectives are incredibly important to us. We value each and every one of you, and your voices matter. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss future content. Your support means everything to us. Wishing you all a great day ahead. And, if you're still with us, drop a phrase in the comments related to the journey of Macy in this story, so we know you listened until the very end. We can't wait to hear from you.